You want to get to the latest out of the Middle East now as we hit that 9 o'clock hour on the East Coast and 6 o'clock hour over on the West Coast. Again, a live look over the border here. Several U.S. officials have expressed concerns that Israel's Iron Dome and its other air defense systems could be overwhelmed by Hezbollah's weapons in the event of a full-scale war. There's been discussion about shifting some of the defense systems from Gaza over to the north, where the Hezbollah terror group has intensified its attacks from Lebanon. I do want to bring in Javed Ali, an associate professor of practice at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, also a former senior U.S. government counterterrorism official, joining us now live to discuss all of this. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Josh, always nice to be with you, and good morning.
Good morning. Well, first off, I do want to talk a little bit about these concerns by the U.S. regarding the Iron Dome there. We know it's a pretty big system, but it does sound as though there is the possibility that it could fail, so to speak, or be overwhelmed as a result of Hezbollah's rockets and weapons.
So the Iron Dome system has been in use in Israel now for decades, and it does provide a pretty good level of air defense capability against a certain volume and level of rocket and missile attacks. But the issue with Hezbollah, even more so than with Hamas, is that Hezbollah over the years, again, if not decades, has amassed an enormous inventory of short and medium range rockets, some longer range rockets, some that actually have features of sort of short range ballistic missiles, and then other types of the much shorter range rockets that Hamas was able to launch against Israel on October 7th and in previous conflicts with Israel. But the scale and scope and the volume of those weapons that Hezbollah possesses is probably several orders of magnitude more than even what Hamas had before October 7th. And so if that's the scale of that type of threat from Hezbollah, that's why these questions about the Iron Dome capability are so serious now, because if there is an actual conflict or shooting war or a ground campaign by Israel against Hezbollah, or, all these different features to it, kind of like they're doing against Hamas, then that rocket and missile threat is the thing that Israel's really going to have to be concerned about.
Yeah, and it is something that so many people have brought up here as there's been the potential for this war to take place. Does it appear, based on what you've seen, that we could actually see Israel and Hezbollah go to a full-scale war?
I would think that for both sides, both for Hezbollah and Israel, there is an enormous amount of risk in actually going forward with a full-out conflict beyond how it's persisted these past several months since October 7th. And for Israel, the risks are so serious because they still haven't wrapped up the campaign in Gaza. The troops have been mobilized now for 8 months, both active duty and reservists. Enormous toll on the military in terms of capability and fatigue and rest. And so now, how would the IDF shift? Even more resources towards the north to fight a much stronger group like Hezbollah. And likewise, Hezbollah sort of has managed to keep this conflict with Israel at a relatively low level and still remain firmly entrenched in power in Lebanon. But they have as much to lose with the war as Israel does with a war against Hezbollah. So I just think the risks are so high for both sides. And beyond the rhetoric, I think it is unlikely. But again, there could be a number of things that kind of spiral out of control quickly. But at a strategic level, I think both Hassan Nasrallah, as the Secretary General of Hezbollah, his sort of supporters in Iran at the Supreme Leader and others, and then on the Israeli side of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the War Cabinet, they have to think this through very carefully.
I want to talk a little bit more about the situation in Gaza overall, because we did hear several days ago from Prime Minister Netanyahu. He posted that very short video on social media where he criticized the U.S. and said they're withholding weapons. Then the U.S. came back and said that's not the case. You know, they're going to be sent there very soon, that sort of thing. So what do you think is the motivation behind all of that? And do you think that this is actually hurting the relationship between the U.S. and Israel even more, creating more of a strain than what already existed?
So, based on the tough rhetoric that both the Israeli government or Prime Minister Netanyahu in his sort of office, and coming from the U.S. side, either at the White House or the State Department, that to me is a sign that this relationship is very strained between, if not the governmental level, I think the rift is probably the deepest between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. That relationship which was very close at a personal level pre-October 7th, and even immediately after October 7th, has only widened. And every time these disputes come out, to me, it just suggests that the two leaders have just grown so far apart in their views about what each country should be doing in support of the other, or in partnership with the other. So that's a serious issue, and I don't get the sense that the U.S. has had this kind of, at least a president and a prime minister have been this distant in a long time, decades. So that's the problem. And then when it comes to the war in Gaza, uh, Prime Minister or President Biden said a couple months ago now that one of the things the U.S. would think about slowing down the resupply of Israel with the large weapon systems, the 2,000-pound type bombs and fitted with the precision guidance systems that Israel had been using very significantly at the beginning of the war, and that's a reason why there were a lot of civilian casualties too. So I think that type of, or those type of weapons have slowed down, but pretty much everything else has floated into Israel, and that's what the State Department spokesperson was talking about. But again, I think the rhetoric between both sides, at least at the President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's not good. And now we're going to have Prime Minister Netanyahu coming to the United States in about a week, and I think this is, in a way, designed from Prime Minister Netanyahu's perspective to get at that issue of his arrival here and what he's going to talk about when he's in the United States.
And could this impact his visit at all overall? I would imagine that regardless of the back and forth there, he's still going to come to the U.S. and address Congress, as he has been invited by the House Speaker and accepted that invitation.
Yeah, unless there's some national emergency in Israel, again, even more another round of conflict with Hezbollah or something goes really wrong in the Gaza Strip, I would have to assume that Prime Minister Netanyahu is intent on coming here to the United States, because that has implications for him domestically, but he's also trying to send a message to the White House by coming here too, sort of picking up on some of those points I made earlier. And I don't know what the full itinerary looks like, but I don't think that he will be hosted by President Biden when he comes. I think he'll just talk to members of Congress. I'm sure he'll have other engagements, but the fact he won't have a public-facing sit-down, or doesn't look like he will have a public-facing sit-down with President Biden, is just an indication of that pretty significant dispute between both men.
You and I have discussed this, I would say, countless times, but I want to talk about a possible ceasefire hostage release deal, because our understanding is that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is going to meet with top Israeli officials again to discuss more about a possible deal. But is it even possible at this point? Because it does appear that Israel and Hamas want two very different things, considering one will approve of a deal that the other doesn't, and vice versa. So is a deal, just based on what you've seen, even possible?
I mean, it's Josh. I mean, as you said, we've talked about this a lot. I think it's possible, but I think it's also unlikely at the moment, because even though the IDF has said that based on about 2 months, almost 2 months worth of military operations in southern Gaza and Rafah, that they're pretty close to dismantling the Hamas's sort of military infrastructure, and really sort of degrading it to the point where Hamas can no longer launch an attack like October 7th. But at the same time, Hamas is still in control of over 100 plus hostages who haven't been recovered. And this is the sticking point, I think, in the deal. And this is the hostages. And I hate to say this, this is the last sort of round of currency that Hamas has to extract more concessions from Israel, whether that's a permanent ceasefire and complete removal of all Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip. That's, I think, the thing that's the toughest issue for both sides to come to some resolution on. And I think another part of the ceasefire deal is the fact that, at least as of today, that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, apparently is still alive, and the military chief of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Mohammed Deif, is still alive too. So, if there were to be a ceasefire, how does that play out, not only at the political level for Prime Minister Netanyahu, with the leaders of Hamas that caused October 7th to be alive, and what does that mean for Hamas's potential to try to conduct another attack in the future if those two men are alive as well? So there's a lot to get to, even to the point of a ceasefire.
And I have to ask, because you did kind of touch on this here, but we do know that the IDF has now said that in a couple weeks or so, the Rafah operation should be quote unquote complete. My question for you, do we know what really comes after that?
Well, that's another sticking point on the ceasefire deal, is that if the IDF is able to achieve its military objectives on the not necessarily on the recovery of all the hostages, but um, destroying and degrading as much of Hamas's military infrastructure as they can, or terrorist infrastructure, then who will then govern uh, the Gaza Strip afterwards? Because it would be unacceptable from Israel's perspective to have Hamas remain in power. Yet there doesn't seem to be a credible alternative right now. Is it revised or renewed Palestinian Authority that is still pretty weak in the West Bank? Is it some kind of external force made up of troops from the UN or other Arab countries? That option has been bandied about, but it doesn't seem like there's any sort of traction for that. So that's another one of these issues in that sort of day after scenario. If we get to a ceasefire, who is going to step in and now govern the Gaza Strip and allow all the humanitarian aid and reconstruction efforts to happen? And there's no clear answer to that.
All right. As always, Javad Ali, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and help break down all the latest developments in the Middle East. Is there anything else that you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
Well, I think the Prime Minister Netanyahu's trip next week, if that happens, and by all accounts it looks like it will, sort of the messages he delivers, the reception he gets, that will be a really interesting kind of moment in this conflict. And whether that alters the course of where things go, that remains to be seen. But I think the next big step is the trip next week.
All right. Thank you again for taking the time to be here with us. We appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Josh.